The old community center had seen better days. Its yellow walls were faded and the wooden floor creaked with every step. But tonight it was packed with people. Families squeezed into rows of metal chairs. Kids fidgeted in their seats and the smell of popcorn drifted through the air. It was the annual talent show, the one event everyone in the neighborhood looked forward to each year. Parents held up phones, ready to record their children's moments of glory. Some kids would sing, others would dance, and a few brave souls would attempt comedy routines that only their families would find funny. The energy in the room was electric, filled with nervous excitement and supportive cheers. Backstage, a 12-year-old boy stood quietly in the corner. His name was David, and he was different from the other performers waiting for their turn. He wore a blue button-up shirt that his mother had ironed 3 times that morning, making sure every crease was perfect. His thick glasses kept sliding down his nose, and he pushed them back up with a familiar gesture he'd done thousands of times before. David had Down syndrome. It was something he'd lived with his entire life, something that made simple tasks harder and caused strangers to stare. He'd grown used to the whispers, the pitying looks, the way some people spoke to him like he was much younger than he really was. But tonight was different. Tonight he had something to prove. His mother, Helen, sat in the 3rd row, right in the middle where she could see everything. Her hands were clasped so tightly together that her knuckles had turned white. She'd barely slept the night before, worried about how the audience might react. She knew her son had talent, real talent, but would others see it? Or would they only see his disability? Helen remembered the day David first discovered the piano. It was 3 years ago at his elementary school. He'd wandered into the music room during lunch break and found an old upright piano sitting in the corner, dusty and mostly forgotten. He'd pressed one key, then another, and something had clicked inside him. His face had lit up in a way Helen had never seen before. From that day forward, David became obsessed with the piano. He begged his parents for lessons, practicing on a small keyboard they'd bought him for his birthday. They found him a teacher, Mrs. Richardson, a patient woman in her 60s who'd taught piano for over 40 years. She saw something special in David right away, something beyond the challenges he faced. The MC's voice boomed through the speakers, announcing the next act. David's stomach tightened. He was up after this performance, after a group of girls finished their dance routine to a popular song. He could hear the music thumping through the walls, the audience clapping along. Mrs. Richardson appeared beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. She'd been like a second mother to him these past years, never losing patience during the difficult lessons, never making him feel less capable than he was. "Remember what we practiced?" she said softly. "Don't think about the notes. Just feel the music. Let it flow through you." David nodded, but his hands were shaking. He'd performed this piece dozens of times in Mrs. Richardson's living room, in his own house, even at the small recital she held for her students. But this was different. This was in front of hundreds of people, most of whom didn't know him, didn't know what he could do. The dance routine ended to thunderous applause. The girls bounced off stage, giggling and hugging each other. The MC returned to the microphone, glancing down at his notes. "Our next performer is a young man who's going to play a classical piece for us tonight. Please welcome David Chen to the stage." Helen's heart hammered in her chest. This was it. She watched as her son walked onto the stage, his gait slightly uneven, his movements deliberate and careful. The bright stage lights hit him, making him squint behind his glasses. The audience's reaction was immediate. Whispers spread like wildfire through the rows. Some people leaned toward their neighbors, pointing. In the back rows, a group of teenagers started snickering, their laughter barely concealed. "Is he really going to play?" one of them said, loud enough for nearby people to hear. "This should be interesting," another muttered, sarcasm dripping from every word. Helen felt her chest tighten with anger and pain. She wanted to turn around and confront them, to tell them to give her son a chance, but she stayed frozen in her seat, her eyes locked on David. On stage, David heard the laughter. Of course he did. He'd heard it before, in school hallways and playgrounds, in grocery stores and parks. People thought he couldn't understand, but he understood perfectly. He knew what they thought of him, what they expected from him. He made his way to the piano, a beautiful black grand that the community center had borrowed for the evening. It was much nicer than anything he'd practiced on before. He sat down on the bench, adjusting his position the way Mrs. Richardson had taught him. His feet barely touched the floor, so he used the technique they'd developed together, balancing himself just right. The microphone was too high. David reached up to adjust it, his movements slow and careful. More laughter rippled through the audience, this time more open, less restrained. Some adults exchanged glances, their eyebrows raised in skepticism. Their expression said everything. This is going to be a disaster. Why did they let him perform? This is embarrassing. A man in the fifth row leaned toward his wife. I hope this doesn't take too long, he whispered. David finally got the microphone to the right height. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing through the suddenly quiet auditorium. Everyone was watching now, waiting to see what would happen. I'm going to play Moonlight Sonata by Beethoven, David announced, his voice steady despite his nerves. More whispers. Moonlight Sonata wasn't an easy piece. It was something advanced piano students struggled with, something that required technical skill and emotional depth. The idea that this boy with Down syndrome could play it seemed impossible to many in the audience. The teenagers in the back row were laughing openly now, no longer trying to hide it. One of them pulled out his phone, probably to record what he expected to be an embarrassing failure, something to share and mock later. Helen's hands gripped the armrests of her chair. She wanted to rush the stage, to grab her son and take him home where he was safe from their judgment, but she knew David would never forgive her. This was his moment, his choice. Mrs. Richardson stood in the wings, her own heart racing. She'd seen David play this piece beautifully countless times, but she also knew that performing under pressure was completely different. One small mistake could derail everything. She said a silent prayer, hoping the hours of practice would carry him through. David looked down at the keys, his fingers hovering above them. The audience waited, some with genuine curiosity, others with barely concealed amusement, ready to see him fail. He took a deep breath. All those hours of practice, all those difficult lessons, all those moments when he'd wanted to quit but pushed through anyway. It all came down to this. The laughter didn't matter. The doubting faces didn't matter. What mattered was the music, the beautiful music that lived inside him, waiting to come out. David placed his hands on the keys, and in that moment everything else faded away. 3 years earlier, David's world had been completely different. He was 9 years old, struggling through 3rd grade at Lincoln Elementary School. Every day felt like climbing a mountain. While other kids breezed through reading assignments, he wrestled with each word. Math problems that took his classmates 5 minutes took him half an hour. He had friends, but not many, and recess often meant standing alone by the fence while others played games he couldn't quite keep up with. His parents worried constantly. Helen would lie awake at night wondering about his future. Would he be able to live independently someday? Would he find work? Would the world be kind to him? These questions haunted her during those quiet, dark hours when worry feels heaviest. David's father, Robert, tried to stay optimistic, but even he had moments of doubt. He'd researched everything about Down syndrome, read every article, joined parent support groups. He wanted to give his son every opportunity, but sometimes the challenges seemed overwhelming. Then came that Tuesday in October, the day that changed everything. David had finished his lunch early in the cafeteria. The noise and chaos of hundreds of kids talking and laughing always made him anxious. He needed quiet, needed space to breathe. So he wandered down the empty hallway, his footsteps echoing on the worn linoleum floor. The music room door was slightly open. David had never been inside before. Music class wasn't part of his schedule, something about budget cuts and limited resources. He peeked in, curious about what lay beyond that doorway. The room smelled like old wood and paper. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust particles dancing in the air. And there in the corner sat an upright piano. It wasn't fancy or new. The wood was scratched, and some of the ivory on the keys had yellowed with age. But to David, it looked magical. He glanced around to make sure no one would yell at him for being there. The room was empty. Slowly, carefully, he walked toward the piano. His hand reached out, trembling slightly, and pressed down on a single white key. The note rang out, clear and pure. David felt it vibrate through his finger, up his arm, into his chest. He pressed another key, then another. Each note was like a tiny miracle, a sound he had created just by touching a key. He didn't know what he was playing. He didn't know anything about music, but something deep inside him responded to those sounds in a way nothing else ever had. He lost track of time, experimenting with different combinations of notes, discovering which ones sounded good together and which ones clashed. It was like solving a puzzle, but better because this puzzle made beautiful sounds. "You like the piano?" David jumped, spinning around. A teacher he didn't know stood in the doorway, a kind smile on her face. She was older, with gray hair pulled back in a loose bun and glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. "I'm sorry," David stammered. "I wasn't supposed to be in here." "It's okay," the woman said, walking into the room. "I'm Mrs. Richardson. I teach music here, though not as much as I used to." "What's your name?" "David." Mrs. Richardson sat down on the piano bench beside him. She played a simple melody, her fingers moving across the keys with practiced ease. David watched, mesmerized. "Would you like me to show you how to play something?" she asked. David nodded, unable to speak. His heart was pounding with excitement. That afternoon, Mrs. Richardson taught him a basic scale. It took him longer than it would take most students. His fingers didn't always want to do what his brain told them to. But he didn't give up, and Mrs. Richardson didn't rush him. She was patient in a way that made him feel safe to try and fail and try again. When the final bell rang and he had to leave, David felt like he was being torn away from something precious. He thought about those piano keys all the way home on the school bus, his fingers tapping imaginary notes on his backpack. That evening at dinner, he could barely eat. He kept humming the scale Mrs. Richardson had taught him, his mind replaying the feeling of the keys under his fingers. "What's gotten into you?" Helen asked, noticing his distraction. "Mom, can I take piano lessons?" Helen and Robert exchanged glances across the table. Piano lessons weren't cheap, and they'd already stretched their budget thin with David's therapy sessions and special tutoring. "Honey, that's expensive," Helen began carefully. "Maybe we can look into it next year." "Please," David said, and there was something in his voice that made both parents pause. It wasn't his usual request for toys or video games. This was different. This was need, not want. Robert saw the determination in his son's eyes, something he'd rarely seen before. "Let me make some calls," he said. It took 2 weeks to arrange. Robert worked extra hours at the warehouse, and Helen picked up weekend shifts at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. They bought a second-hand keyboard from a yard sale, setting it up in David's small bedroom. Mrs. Richardson agreed to teach him privately, twice a week after school. She charged much less than her normal rate, though she never told David's parents that. She'd seen something in that boy during their brief encounter in the music room, a spark she recognized from her decades of teaching. The first few months were brutal. David's coordination issues made everything harder. His fingers would slip off keys. He'd forget which note came next. Reading sheet music felt like trying to decode an alien language. Some lessons ended with him in tears of frustration, convinced he'd never get it right. "Maybe this isn't for him," Helen whispered to Robert one night after a particularly difficult practice session. They could hear David in his room struggling through the same simple piece for the 100th time. "Give him more time," Robert said, though doubt crept into his own voice. But David refused to quit. Even on days when everything went wrong, when his fingers felt clumsy and the notes all sounded terrible, he'd sit back down at that keyboard. Something about music spoke to him in a language beyond words, beyond the difficulties that made so much of life hard. Mrs. Richardson adjusted her teaching methods for him. She color-coded the sheet music, breaking complex pieces into tiny, manageable sections. She discovered that David had an unusual gift for emotional expression. When he finally mastered a piece, he didn't just play the notes. He felt them, poured himself into them in ways that moved her to tears. "You have something special," she told him one day, 6 months into their lessons. "Not everyone can make music feel alive the way you do." David didn't fully understand what she meant then. He just knew that when he played, the world made sense. The kids who ignored him at school didn't matter. The hard tests and confusing homework didn't matter. At the piano, he was free. By the time he turned 11, he'd progressed further than Mrs. Richardson had expected. He wasn't the fastest student she'd ever taught, and he still made mistakes. But his dedication was unlike anything she'd seen in her 40 years of teaching. "I want to learn Moonlight Sonata," David announced one day. Mrs. Richardson raised her eyebrows. It was an ambitious choice, a piece that challenged even advanced students. "That's very difficult, David. It might take a long time." "I don't care how long it takes," he said with quiet determination. "I want to play it," so they began. Month after month, they worked on that single piece. There were setbacks and breakthroughs, moments of despair and moments of triumph. David practiced until his fingers ached, until he could play sections in his sleep. His parents watched their son transform. The shy, struggling boy began to carry himself differently. He had found something he was good at, something that was his alone. When the community center announced its annual talent show, Mrs. Richardson suggested David perform. Helen's first instinct was to say no, to protect him from potential embarrassment. But David wanted to do it. "I'm ready," he told his mother, his voice steady and sure, and so they signed him up, not knowing that this decision would change everything. David's fingers touched the keys, and the first note of Moonlight Sonata floated into the air. Soft, gentle, like a whisper in the darkness. The second note followed, then the third. The opening of the piece was delicate, almost fragile, requiring a lightness of touch that seemed impossible for someone who struggled with fine motor control. But David had spent 18 months preparing for this moment. 18 months of practicing the same measures over and over until his fingers knew them by heart. 18 months of Mrs. Richardson's patient guidance, breaking down every phrase, every dynamic, every subtle shift in emotion. The audience's laughter began to fade. Not all at once, but gradually, like water draining from a sink. A few people in the front rows leaned forward, surprised by what they were hearing. The notes were coming out clean and clear, not the jumbled mess they'd expected. Helen's hands slowly unclenched. She'd been holding her breath without realizing it. Now she let it out in a long, shaky exhale. Her son was actually doing it. He was playing Beethoven in front of all these people, and he was doing it well. The teenagers in the back row stopped laughing too, though they still wore smirks on their faces. They were waiting for him to mess up, waiting for the moment they could say they knew it would happen. David's world had narrowed to just him and the piano. The audience disappeared. The bright lights faded. There was only the music flowing from somewhere deep inside him, traveling through his arms and into his fingers, becoming sound. This was why he loved the piano. When he played, nothing else existed. Not the whispers or the stares, not the difficulties or the challenges, just pure music. Mrs. Richardson watched from the side of the stage, her hands clasped tightly together. She could see every movement David made, could anticipate each phrase because she'd taught him every single one. She noticed a slight hesitation before a difficult passage and held her breath. "Come on, David," she thought. "You know this. You've played it 100 times." David navigated the tricky section smoothly. His tempo was slower than a professional pianist would play it, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that he was telling a story through the music, painting pictures with sound. The Moonlight Sonata wasn't just notes on a page to him. It was emotion made audible, feeling transformed into melody. The piece moved into its rising and falling patterns, the left hand keeping steady while the right hand danced across the higher keys. David's face showed intense concentration. His eyebrows furrowed, his lips pressed together. Every ounce of his being was focused on getting this right, on showing everyone what he could do. A woman in the 7th row felt tears prick her eyes, though she couldn't quite explain why. There was something pure about this performance, something honest and real that touched something deep inside her. She glanced at her husband and saw that he too had stopped fidgeting, his attention completely captured by the boy on stage. Robert sat beside Helen, his arm around her shoulders. He was thinking about all the times he'd worried about his son's future, all the sleepless nights wondering if David would ever find his place in the world. Watching him now, seeing the confidence in his posture, the certainty in his movements, Robert realized that David had already found it. Right here at this piano, his son was exactly where he belonged. The music continued to unfold, each phrase building on the last. David hit a wrong note, his finger slipping slightly on a black key. A few people in the audience shifted in their seats, exchanging knowing glances. "See," their expression said. "We knew this would happen." But David didn't stop. Mrs. Richardson had taught him that mistakes were part of performing, that the real skill was in continuing, in not letting one error destroy everything that came after. He recovered immediately, sliding back into the piece as if the wrong note had never happened. In fact, that small mistake made the performance more powerful. It proved David was human, that he was really up there playing this difficult piece live, not just pressing buttons on a recording. The imperfection made the beauty of everything else stand out even more. The first movement of the Moonlight Sonata is haunting and melancholic. Beethoven wrote it like a funeral march, slow and somber, filled with deep emotion. David understood this somehow. Even though he'd never been to a funeral, even though he couldn't read the complex analyses that music scholars had written about the piece, he understood it in his bones, in his heart, and that understanding came through in his playing. More people in the audience were sitting up straighter now. The whispers had stopped almost entirely. Even the teenagers in the back had gone quiet, their phones lowered, their attention drawn to the stage despite themselves. A little girl sitting with her grandmother tugged on the older woman's sleeve. "Grandma, he's really good," she whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. The grandmother nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She'd been teaching elementary school for 30 years and had seen countless children with disabilities struggle to find acceptance. Watching this boy command the stage with his talent, proving wrong everyone who'd underestimated him, felt like a victory for every student she'd ever fought for. David's hands moved across the keyboard with growing confidence. The muscle memory was taking over now, his fingers finding their places without conscious thought. This was the magic of all those hours of practice, all those repetitions that had seemed pointless at the time. His body knew what to do, even when his mind started to wander. He thought about his first day at the piano, how clumsy he'd felt, how impossible it had seemed that he'd ever be able to play real music. He thought about all the times he'd wanted to quit, when the frustration had felt like too much to bear. He was glad now that he hadn't given up, that he'd pushed through those difficult moments. The music swelled and receded like waves on a shore. Soft passages gave way to slightly louder ones, then back to whispers. David's whole body swayed gently with the rhythm, not because anyone had taught him to do that, but because the music moved him physically as well as emotionally. Mrs. Richardson felt a tear slide down her cheek. In all her years of teaching, she'd had talented students, prodigies even, but she'd never had a student who worked as hard as David, who wanted it as much as he did. Talent was wonderful, but dedication was rarer and more valuable. David had both, and watching him share his gift with the world filled her with a pride she'd rarely experienced. The piece moved toward its conclusion, the notes climbing and falling, creating patterns that felt both mathematical and deeply human. David's fingers flew across the keys now, faster than they'd moved at the beginning, building toward the final moments. His glasses had slipped down his nose again, but he couldn't push them up without stopping his playing. So he left them there, slightly crooked, and kept going. Nothing would interrupt him now. He was so close to finishing, so close to proving to everyone, including himself, that he could do this. The audience was completely silent now. Even the people who'd doubted him, who'd laughed and whispered, were holding their breath, waiting to see how this would end. The boy they'd underestimated was commanding their attention, holding them captive with nothing but his 2 hands and a piano. David played the final phrase, his fingers pressing down on the keys with gentle firmness. The last notes hung in the air, fading slowly into silence. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. He'd played Moonlight Sonata from beginning to end in front of hundreds of people, and he hadn't fallen apart. For a moment, the auditorium was completely still. David sat at the piano, his hands still resting on the keys, his chest heaving with the effort and emotion of the performance. He didn't know what would happen next. Would they clap? Would they laugh now that it was over? Then something incredible happened. The silence lasted only a heartbeat, but to David it felt like forever. He sat frozen at the piano bench, his hands still resting on the keys, wondering if he'd done something wrong. Had he messed up worse than he thought? Was everyone too shocked to react? Then it started. One person began clapping, then another, then 5 more. Within seconds, the entire auditorium erupted into thunderous applause. But it wasn't just clapping. People were standing up, rising from their metal chairs like a wave rolling toward the shore. Row by row, they got to their feet, their hands coming together in appreciation that echoed off the walls. David turned on the bench, his eyes wide with disbelief. They were clapping for him. Actually clapping. Not the polite, obligatory applause you give because it's the nice thing to do. This was real. This was genuine appreciation, and the sound of it was overwhelming. Helen jumped to her feet so fast she nearly knocked over her chair. Tears were streaming down her face now, not tears of worry or fear, but pure joy. She clapped until her palms hurt, watching her son take in the moment. Robert was beside her, his own eyes wet, clapping so hard his hands would be red for an hour afterward. "That's my boy," he kept saying over and over. "That's my boy." Mrs. Richardson rushed onto the stage, her usual composure completely gone. She wrapped David in a tight hug, and he could feel her shaking with emotion. When she pulled back, she was crying too, smiling through her tears. "You are magnificent," she said, loud enough for him to hear over the applause. "Absolutely magnificent." David felt something crack open inside his chest, something warm and bright spreading through him. He'd worked so hard for this moment, dreamed about it during countless practice sessions. But the reality was bigger and better than anything he'd imagined. He'd proven something tonight, not just to the audience, but to himself. The teenagers in the back row were on their feet too. The same kids who'd laughed when he walked on stage were now clapping as hard as anyone. One of them, a tall boy with a football jersey, had tears running down his face. He wasn't even trying to hide them. His friend next to him, the one who'd pulled out his phone to record what he thought would be a failure, was still recording. But now he was capturing something completely different, something beautiful and unexpected. "Man, I feel terrible," the boy with the phone said to his friend, his voice thick with emotion. "We shouldn't have laughed." "I know," the other one replied, wiping his eyes. "I really didn't think he could do it. I was so wrong." The applause continued, building rather than fading. People were whistling now, cheering, calling out encouragement. The little girl who'd been sitting with her grandmother was jumping up and down, clapping with her hands high above her head. An older man in a veteran's cap, who'd seen a lot in his 70-some years, stood with his hand over his heart, deeply moved by what he'd witnessed. David stood up from the piano bench and took a bow, just like Mrs. Richardson had taught him. His movements were a bit stiff, a bit awkward, but none of that mattered. The audience cheered even louder if that was possible. Some people had their phones out now, taking pictures and videos, wanting to capture and remember this moment. Helen couldn't wait any longer. She pushed past people in her row, muttering apologies as she made her way to the aisle. She needed to get to her son. Robert followed right behind her, both of them rushing toward the stage. When David saw his parents coming, his careful composure finally broke. His face crumpled and he started crying, big tears rolling down his cheeks. But he was smiling too, the biggest smile anyone had ever seen on his face. Helen climbed onto the stage and grabbed him, holding him tight against her. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered into his hair, "so incredibly proud." "I did it, Mom," David said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "I really did it." "You sure did, buddy," Robert said, joining the embrace. "You absolutely sure did." The audience was still clapping, giving them this moment, sharing in the pure joy and love on that stage. It was the kind of thing that reminded people why community mattered, why gathering together to celebrate each other's achievements was important. The MC stood off to the side, wiping his own eyes. He'd hosted this talent show for 8 years and had seen hundreds of performances. But he'd never seen anything quite like this. He'd never seen an entire audience transform the way these people had been transformed. Finally, the applause began to die down. People slowly took their seats again, though the energy in the room had completely changed. Everyone was talking excitedly, buzzing with what they'd just witnessed. Parents hugged their own children a little tighter. People who'd been strangers smiled at each other, connected by this shared experience. David, his parents, and Mrs. Richardson made their way off the stage. As they walked down the steps, people reached out to touch David's shoulder, to shake his hand, to tell him how wonderful he'd been. He was overwhelmed by it all, but in the best possible way. "Young man, that was something special," said the veteran in the cap, his weathered hand gentle on David's arm. "You've got a real gift." "Thank you," David managed to say, still processing everything that was happening. A woman approached Helen, her own daughter, who had Down syndrome, holding her hand. The girl looked about 7 years old, with similar features to David. "Thank you," the woman said to Helen, her voice emotional. "You don't know what it means to us to see him up there, to see what's possible." Helen squeezed the woman's hand, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She just nodded, understanding completely what this woman was saying. Representation mattered. Seeing someone like you succeed mattered more than words could express. The talent show continued with other acts, but nothing else that night could match what David had done. A girl sang a pop song beautifully, A boy did impressive magic tricks. A group performed a comedy sketch that got lots of laughs, but people kept talking about the piano performance, kept coming back to it in their minds. During intermission, David sat in the lobby with his parents, drinking juice from a small box and trying to calm down from the adrenaline rush. People kept approaching him and he was gracious to everyone even though he was exhausted. The teenagers from the back row found him there. David tensed when he saw them coming, remembering their laughter. But the tall one in the football jersey knelt down in front of him, getting on David's level. "Hey man, I owe you an apology," he said, his voice sincere. "I laughed at you before you started playing and that was really messed up. I judged you without giving you a chance and I'm sorry. That was one of the most amazing things I've ever seen." His friend nodded. "Same here. I'm really sorry, you're incredibly talented." David looked at them for a moment, then smiled. "It's okay," he said simply. "I'm used to it." "Well, you shouldn't have to be," the first teenager said. "What you did up there, that took real guts. I don't know if I could get up in front of all these people and do what you did. You're braver than I am." The teens shook David's hand, then walked away, talking quietly to each other about what they'd learned that night. Helen watched them go, grateful that her son's performance had touched them so deeply, that maybe they'd think twice before judging someone else. As the evening wound down and families started heading home, Mrs. Richardson pulled Helen aside. "You know," she said, "I've been teaching piano for over 40 years. I've taught some students who went on to become professional musicians. But I don't think I've ever been more proud of anyone than I am of David tonight. What he overcame to get on that stage, what he proved, that's bigger than just music." Helen nodded, fresh tears coming to her eyes. "Thank you," she said, "for believing in him, for seeing what he could do." "Oh, he showed me what he could do," Mrs. Richardson replied with a smile. "I just gave him the tools. Everything else was David." As they drove home that night, David fell asleep in the back seat, exhausted but happy. Helen turned around to look at him, his face peaceful in the glow of passing streetlights. "Things are going to be different now," Robert said quietly, keeping his eyes on the road. "What do you mean?" Helen asked. "People saw him tonight, really saw him, not just his disability. Word's going to spread. This is just the beginning." Robert had no idea how right he was. Robert was right. Things did change, though none of them could have predicted how much or how quickly. The next morning, David woke up to his phone buzzing with notifications. His father had set up a simple social media account for him months ago, mainly so he could share practice videos with Mrs. Richardson. Overnight, that account had exploded. The video of his performance that the teenager had recorded and posted online was spreading like wildfire. 100 views became 1,000. 1,000 became 10,000. By lunchtime, it had hit 100,000. People were sharing it everywhere, adding comments that made Helen cry every time she read them. "This is what courage looks like. I've been playing piano for 20 years, and this kid has more soul in one performance than I've had in my entire career. My son has Down syndrome and is only 4. Thank you for showing me what his future could look like." "I'm not crying. You're crying." The comments kept coming, from all over the country, then from around the world. Someone in Japan shared it. Then someone in Brazil, then Germany, then Australia. David's performance was touching people on every continent, crossing language barriers and cultural boundaries. A reporter from the local news station called Tuesday afternoon, then another from a bigger station. By Wednesday, there were news vans parked outside their house. Helen and Robert tried to shield David from most of it, but the attention was unavoidable. The first interview aired Thursday evening. David sat on the couch with his parents, wearing the same blue shirt he'd worn for the performance. The reporter, a kind woman named Patricia, asked him gentle questions about his love of music and what it felt like to perform. "It felt like I was flying," David said, his face lighting up with the memory. "Like nothing could stop me." The interview ended with footage of his performance. Watching it again, seeing himself on television playing that piano, David felt a strange mix of pride and disbelief. Was that really him? Had he really done that? At school on Friday, everything was different. Kids who'd never spoken to him before suddenly knew his name. They wanted to sit with him at lunch, talk to him in the hallways, hear about the performance. Some of it felt genuine, but some felt strange, like they were interested in him because he was famous now, not because they actually cared about who he was. But there were bright spots too. A girl named Claire from his English class approached him at his locker. She was quiet like him, someone who also spent a lot of time on the edges of social groups. "I saw your video," she said shyly. "It was really beautiful. I paint, and your music made me feel the same way I feel when I'm creating something, like everything else disappears." David smiled. "Yeah, exactly like that." They became friends after that, finding common ground in their creative passions. Claire would show David her paintings, and he'd play music for her during lunch period in the empty band room. Real friendship, built on understanding rather than fame. The teenagers who'd apologized to him after the performance kept their word. The tall one with the football jersey, whose name was Tyler, started volunteering at the community center where David practiced. He'd help set up for events, carry equipment, and he made a point of talking to the kids with disabilities who came there for various programs. "That night changed me," Tyler told his friends one day. "I realized I'd been going through life making assumptions about people. David taught me that everyone has something valuable to offer if you just give them a chance." By the second week, David had been invited to perform at 3 different charity events. Mrs. Richardson helped him prepare, making sure he didn't get overwhelmed by all the attention and opportunities coming his way. They picked events that meant something, causes that mattered. The first was a fundraiser for Special Olympics. David played for an audience of families who understood exactly what his accomplishment meant, because they lived with similar challenges every day. The applause that night was different from the talent show. It was deeper, more personal, filled with recognition and hope. A mother approached Helen afterward, holding the hand of her teenage son who had cerebral palsy. "We've been told so many times what our children can't do," the woman said, her voice shaking with emotion. "But you and David, you're showing the world what they can do. You're opening doors for all of us." That's when Helen truly understood the weight of what had happened. David's performance wasn't just about one boy playing piano. It had become something bigger, a symbol of possibility for families everywhere, who were fighting for their children to be seen and valued. The video eventually reached 15 million views. News outlets from major networks wanted to interview David. Talk shows called. But Helen and Robert were careful about what they accepted. They didn't want to exploit their son or turn his achievement into a circus. They chose opportunities that felt meaningful, that would actually help other families. One of those opportunities came from an unexpected place. A music school in their city, one of the prestigious ones that usually only accepted students through rigorous auditions, reached out. They wanted to offer a full scholarship to David if he was interested. Mrs. Richardson encouraged him to take it. "You've learned everything I can teach you," she said, though it clearly broke her heart a little to say it. "It's time for you to work with people who can take you to the next level." David was torn. Mrs. Richardson had been there from the beginning. She was safe, familiar, patient in ways he wasn't sure other teachers would be. But he also wanted to grow, to keep pushing himself. "I'll still come visit you," he promised her. "You'll always be my first real teacher." The music school opened doors David never knew existed. His new instructor, a former concert pianist named Mr. Kowalski, was demanding but fair. He pushed David hard, but never made him feel less capable because of his Down syndrome. He simply expected excellence and helped David work toward it. Within 6 months, David was performing regularly. Small venues at first, then bigger ones. He played at a benefit concert for children's hospitals. He performed at a conference for educators about inclusive learning. Each time he played, he touched people, reminding them that ability comes in many forms. But perhaps the most important thing that happened wasn't about David at all. Mrs. Richardson, inspired by everything that had occurred, started a program at the community center. She called it Music for Everyone, and it offered free or low-cost piano lessons to children with disabilities. The program started small, with just 5 students. But word spread quickly. Parents who'd been told their children couldn't learn music, that their disabilities made it impossible, brought their kids to try. Some of them struggled. Some of them thrived. But all of them were given a chance, and that's what mattered. David volunteered with the program when he could, helping younger students, encouraging them when they got frustrated. He understood their challenges in a way no one else could. He'd lived them. Don't give up, he'd tell them during difficult practice sessions. I know it's hard. I know it feels impossible sometimes. But if you keep trying, if you don't let anyone tell you that you can't do something, amazing things can happen. 1 year after the talent show, the community center held another annual event. This time, there was no laughter when students with disabilities took the stage. This time, the audience knew better. They'd learned from David that you can't judge someone's abilities by looking at them. That talent and determination come in all packages. David performed again that night, playing a new piece he'd been working on. The applause was just as loud as it had been the year before. But something felt different to him. He wasn't playing to prove anything anymore. He wasn't playing to show people they were wrong about him. He was playing simply because he loved it, because music was part of who he was, as natural as breathing. And that, more than anything else, was the real victory. As he stood and bowed that night, David looked out at the audience. He saw Tyler sitting with a group of kids from the volunteer program. He saw the woman with the daughter who had Down syndrome, her little girl beaming with pride. He saw his parents, their faces glowing with love. He saw Mrs. Richardson dabbing her eyes with a tissue, and he saw dozens of other faces, people whose lives had been touched by his story, who'd learned to see past their own assumptions and prejudices. People who'd been reminded that every person, regardless of their challenges, has value and potential. The boy who'd been laughed at had done more than prove them wrong. He'd changed hearts and opened minds. He'd shown that the only real limitations are the ones we place on each other and ourselves. And that was worth more than all the applause in the world. David smiled, pushed his glasses up his nose one more time, and walked off the stage. He had practicing to do tomorrow. After all, there was always another piece to learn, another challenge to overcome, another person to inspire. The music and the journey would never truly end.